Hey guys.
Hey everyone.
Hey, how are you?
Good, good. I think we got a bit of feedback somewhere. Is that it? Okay, is that me? I hope it's not me. Well, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Jon Rice. I'm with Cointelegraph as an editor. And with me today, discussing NFTs, art, value, economics, and all of that good stuff. I have apparently a police cruiser. We've got Robby Yung, Sam Williams, Al Morris, and Kevin Abosch. I'm not going to go around and ask you guys to introduce yourselves on this occasion, simply because everybody who's done that so far has been far too humble. And so I'm going to do it for you. Kevin Abosch is a conceptual artist from Ireland, one of the pioneers of blockchain-based art, who's been featured in museums around the world, including the Hermitage and the National Gallery of Ireland, the National Museum of China. He sold Forever Rose on Ethereum for $1 million in 2018 on the 14th of February. And Skype executive Michael Jackson paid $400,000 for Yellow Lambo later that year. Kevin, great to see you. Robby Yung is the CEO of Animoca Brands. He has experience with software, telecoms, blockchain, and multiple startups, and Animoca publishes games including The Sandbox, F1 Delta Time, and Rev Motorsport. Sam Williams. Is that better? That's way better. Sam Williams is the co-founder and the CEO of Arweave, a decentralized storage system that aims to make data permanent. This perma-web is described as a global community-owned web that anyone can contribute to or get paid to maintain. And last but not least, Al Morris is the architect and founder at Koi Network. Some of you may have met him earlier. Koi aims to change the way we exchange value and interact with the internet based on the notion of an attention economy in which creators are directly rewarded for the attention paid to their art, their music, their words. And Al and his team aim to build a fairer internet, and they've just developed the first dynamic NFT that responds directly to your personal love and attention. So guys, thanks for joining us. I'll kick right off by just saying some of this conversation is going to be somewhat philosophical. We are, after all, dealing with art. So I've heard sort of various definitions of art, and I'm going to sum up my personal favorite in one line. Art is what people say it is, and it's worth what people are prepared to pay for it. Kevin, you once sold a photograph of a potato, an Irish potato, for $1 million. What are your thoughts on pixelated JPEGs that are selling for multiples of that number?
Look, people are entitled to, whatever to pay for.
I think we've discovered the source of the problem here, Kevin. I think your mic is misconfigured somehow.
If we claim this is art, is it art? Because I think that robot voice for Kevin is pretty good.
It's pretty artistic.
This is performance art for sure.
Performance art. Performance art NFT though.
Clearly, no.
No, we're hearing Marvin the Paranoid Android right now.
Is that better? Is that better?
Oh yeah,
it's better.
Now I'm using the computer mic. Okay, yeah. So I mean, it's whatever people are entitled to pay whatever they want for whatever it is they want to buy, and sometimes it's a function of consensus. If enough people decide that something has enough value, even if you start off thinking these people are crazy for spending $5,000 on a blue, purple plush toy like Peanut the elephant, a Beanie Baby, or something like that. The fact is, if enough people believe it's worth that, and you see one in the thrift shop for $100, you're thinking to yourself, you know what? Even though I think it's mad, I'll spend $100 on this thing that I thought was worthless yesterday. So that's actually what I think is interesting is not on our own volition what we might decide to part with our money for, but when there's sort of something reach a critical mass and we're sucked into this system whether we like it or not. That's I think particularly interesting.
So I'm just going to do a couple of straw polls throughout the course of this panel. So we're all aware of what's going on in crypto art right now. We have avatars, we have loot projects, which are just words on a screen to some people, but they have an intrinsic value to others. Are we in an NFT bubble? And I'm just going to give you kind of like 30 seconds each to go around and explain why or why not. We'll start with you, Sam.
Yes, obviously yes. Also,
okay.
That's probably okay. I think that a lot of good things start in bubbles. There's a lot of hype. There's a lot of, trashy stuff that gets done. Frankly, there's also a lot of good stuff. And over time, the trashy stuff sort of disappears and the good stuff comes to the fore. So I think that technological waves come very, very frequently, if not always, associated with these bubble cycles economically. And it's pretty clear that we're in one of those.
Robby, do you disagree or agree?
I'm going to mildly disagree, only because I think that people spending ridiculous amounts of money in public to show other people they can do it has gone on for centuries.
Yeah, that's true. That's fair.
So flexing is okay and has historic value as well. Al?
It's kind of a form of copyright, though, isn't it? It's like a way of saying that you own that thing, which that's going to continue going forever. And now we just have better technology for it. So I have a feeling once people get used to that idea of owning things, they're not going to turn back, really. It's kind of hard to, right?
Fair enough. And Kevin, I'm leaving you to last on this question because obviously you're kind of most invested in that question. As a working artist, are we in a bubble? And if not, what comes next?
I don't really think of it in terms of bubble. I think that art is art, whether it's physical or immaterial. I think sometimes we see this conflation of art that happens to be on an NFT, collectibles that happen to be on an NFT, virtual assets in a game that happen to be on an NFT. I think these need to be siloed to some extent to fully understand the nature of what's happening with them. I definitely don't think there's a bubble of any sort with say virtual goods in gaming. With collectibles, possibly. And certainly, we know there's a lot of there are some bad actors in the background that are pumping and dumping, etc. And they always have in the art world too. But I wouldn't characterize it as a bubble. I would just say we're somewhere in the middle of a natural hype cycle.
Okay. So Sam, I'll address this one to you. We talk about a Renaissance period in art, in the Mona Lisa, Da Vinci being kind of a product of that era. But as we talk about the Renaissance period, we also talk about a transition between kind of the medieval and the modern age, the industrial age, if you will. Do you feel that the current Renaissance in crypto art is indicative of a transformation in society from something and to something else?
I think that the most interesting component of this appears to be the one that people are paying the least attention to, which is that when you bought a piece of art, so when you're the owner of a piece of art in the physical space, you are able to make that art scarce or inaccessible to other people. So typically, buy a painting, and by default, it doesn't end up in a public gallery. Whereas actually what's happening in the crypto art space is the exact opposite. And for what it's worth, in the physical space, that kind of control over the art appears to be where at least some of the value comes from. Now, in the crypto art space, something much, much cooler is happening, but I don't think that we have the right words to describe it yet. It would seem to me like what we have is actually sponsorship of art rather than ownership of art. Because if you buy a piece of art that is essentially a JPEG on the permaweb, the whole point of the permaweb is it makes everything available to all people at all times forever, and it doesn't stop, right? So it's permanently publicly available, if you will, displayed in a kind of gallery. when you buy a piece of crypto art, you're not optimizing for, let me make it scarce for other people, let me control it, because you have none of that. Actually, what you're doing is you're flexing, right? You're saying, well, let's have other people know that I'm associated with this really cool piece of art. And I think that's actually very, very exciting, because long term, this means you get more people able to enjoy, essentially, more forms of art, without destroying the incentives for creators like Kevin, for example, to actually create great art. So I think that transition is pretty fundamental, but it's also not what people are talking about, because they keep talking about ownership. And it strikes me that typically, if I own something in the physical space, if I own a piece of crypto, actually, if I own some Satoshis, I control them, right? I can move them around, I can do something with them. But an NFT, I can't control the asset itself. No one controls the asset, and that's almost the point. So I think that there's something really exciting happening there, but I think it'll also be a while before we grapple with what that properly means.
Okay, so Al, if you guys will excuse me, you're one of our younger panelists here. What Sam seems to be describing is, to me, a somewhat demographic shift between a previous attitude towards material possessions and an emerging attitude. Would you say within your age peer group there is a difference in how you think people perceive material possessions today versus an older generation like me?
I think there really is. I think it's also partially because of the reality we live in, right? So I've been online my entire life, as have most of my peers. There's also less stuff for us to actually go and have, because we've got more people now and there's actually less things available for us to have usually. So there's kind of this is probably why a lot of the economy is shifting towards experiential things, right? Because you can't go and buy a Mustang when you're 18 now. It just doesn't work that way. The really neat thing about what Sam was just mentioning, though, which is very cool and kind of I think ties into the bigger picture here, is there's this idea of access to the content. And that's really very interesting to me, because it's also about inspiration, right? Kevin, actually, you told me about 3 months ago that our art is about kind of making people ask why a little bit, because then it gets them thinking and then it changes them a little bit. And that's kind of the very interesting concept here, is that if you have all this information in an open place and everybody has access to it and they can all see it, then the inspiration that it can provide is amplified exponentially. And people are starting to realize that now, which is why we love all of these, we love following celebrities, because we are able to be inspired by them constantly, continuously, right? It's this feed of information that kind of feeds into who you become as a person. And I think once you get used to having that constant access to the internet and to all these ideas and all these people, it's really hard to turn it off. The same goes for video games too. I used to play World of Warcraft, so did Vitalik Buterin. So when you're in World of Warcraft and you're really used to World of Warcraft, items in World of Warcraft are more meaningful than physical things. But it's all about this kind of interaction that you have with these things that exist.
Right, and Robby, that kind of goes directly to your sphere of expertise. You have a vast audience of gaming enthusiasts, Animoca. Do you see consistent demographic patterns there? Do you see that there's a user base that's particularly engaged with in-game assets and with blockchain gaming, and there's going to be more, if you like, of an early adopter of NFTs? And if so, what does that demographic look like?
So I think we see quite a broad demographic. I think the early adopters in blockchain gaming were people who were crypto native, because you have to go through setting up a wallet and being somewhat comfortable with the whole idea of how crypto functions, which is much more complicated than where we are with the development of onboarding in mobile apps at this point, which is probably the smoothest onboarding experience of anything in technology. And so I think many people have gotten accustomed to how easy it is to download an app, and within literally probably 5 clicks, you can purchase something. And we in the mobile game industry have been working for years to make it that simple. I think, for blockchain gaming, we will get there. But I have to keep reminding people that despite, some early successes from many of our colleagues in the industry, it's very early. Don't forget, Angry Birds came out in 2011. That's 3 years after the App Store opened, and most people can't remember a game before Angry Birds. And how far are we into NFTs? We're less than, barely 3 years into the invention of an NFT.
So with that said, okay, so the App Store, if you like, democratized access to the idea of applications. Kevin, you're an artist with a background in fine art. You've made a transition from photography, where you were very successful, to NFT-based art. What are some of the hurdles that you encountered, both technologically and in terms of developing a new audience for your work?
So that's the funny thing is, I think there are a lot of people who know my, let's call it crypto art, who aren't really aware of the a whole lifetime of work before that. And then I have a whole lifetime of collectors of other work, which is not just photography, but pretty challenging, mixed media, conceptual, technologically, generative art, before crypto, and in many of them, especially the older ones, they don't know how to engage with the newer work. In my case, even more so, they want to understand the connection between these two worlds. For me, it's a continuum; it's all the same. But it's as an artist, I treat my subject the same way. I think everyone on this panel knows I use blockchain itself as a medium to make art. It's not just a delivery mechanism for me. I'm interested in the technology and how it addresses and helps me explore ontologically the nature of value and identity, and explore the power of decentralization to empower the disenfranchised and the less fortunate. I think there's a bit of education that has to take place. You talked about philosophical discussion. I have to address a group of about 2,000 rather sophisticated art collectors next month who know nothing about blockchain. And I'm not going to dumb it down for them. I'll give them a little primer on the tech, but I think they appreciate understanding the philosophical implications of this technology. And I think also if I can help them get over the idea that the physical assets are intrinsically more valuable, even more monetarily valuable than virtual assets, I think that you can go a long way with that. And by the way, one of the ways I've been doing that is by showing that virtual assets are hyper physical. As we all know, it takes millions of invisible faces behind the companies that make the hardware. The NFTs can't be experienced, without hardware. So I think if you can teach them that this thing that they think is immaterial is actually hyper physical, it becomes more difficult for them to distinguish the two.
So one of the criticisms that tends to get leveled occasionally at the crypto art world, and maybe NFTs in general, is the idea that they don't feel permanent. They're transient assets. Sam, you've been developing a network that you describe as the perma-web. What is the purpose of permanence? Why do we need something that lasts beyond a human lifetime? And again, I'm being very philosophical here, just because the ins and outs of decentralized storage, if you like, are probably for another discussion. So why do we need that?
I guess in the most abstract sense, it appears that collections of humans make better new ideas if they have access to more old ideas. And if we can make a system that allows us to simply remember all good ideas forever, sort of logically, it stands to reason that we'll end up generating more better ideas in the future. I guess in the most abstract sense, that's kind of what it's about. What got us into it in the first place was essentially creating a system that would make the memory hole from 1984 impossible. This idea that authoritarian states can simply throw away records of the past and now no one knows what happened. And essentially in doing so, they can control how people act in the future. We wanted to make sure that never happened again, because the world appeared to be moving in a direction where, unfortunately, in the West, you could say that the probability of that kind of situation arising was increasing. So that's what got us started on it. It was like, how can we store newspaper articles permanently? And then, of course, once you've made a ledger for that, well, you have a ledger for all permanent information storage. And then when it comes to NFTs, it's, it's personally my belief that NFTs is one of the most obvious tip of the iceberg use cases for Arweave, because it's like, well, I've got this digital asset. I'm paying a lot of money for it. Why on earth would I want it to disappear if I had the option to make it last forever? It just stands to reason, right? Particularly if the cost is like, fractions of a cent, essentially. So I think that's how that kind of occurred in the NFT space, that people found Arweave's used for it. But I think that's the start, not the end of what people use the network for sure. And I actually think that there are already experiments happening in this zone with like what Koi is working on that really step out further than where the NFTs are. So after we've got to the idea of, okay, well, what if we have scarce ownership? And I think it's fair to say that is kind of about flexing, right? Because it's not about control anymore, which would be typically ownership would be a bundle of rights. And one of those rights, or many of those rights actually, require you to exert some control. So you don't have that. But what you do have is flexing with your profile picture on Twitter. Fine. But on top of that, we have this really interesting idea of monetizing the allocation of attention, which is what Al has basically done with Koi and the rest of the team, making an attention betting market, which I think that in the future, will be the next stage of where NFTs go, I would guess.
It kind of feels like he's handing that off to you, Al, to talk about where NFTs will go beyond these, static JPEGs, these, digital files. Let's kind of be futurists for a minute and start considering where NFTs have value beyond crypto art. What are some other applications you see for this tech?
So I'll pick up from the bundle of rights comment, because I think that's a really, really good way of putting it. I mean, that's like the whole point of having these kinds of ledgers as a species, is to coordinate behavior. And that's because we have rules. And you have to have rules that are written down as part of the game in order to be able to play the game. And so in our case, actually, what it's quickly becoming, kind of as Sam mentioned, is our survival is mostly about creating information now. That's what we do. It's also the thing that you can do that's the most permanent, ironically. Like even just sharing an idea with another person has a greater likelihood of living on than anything that you create physically. I tried making a wood carving recently. So that's like, maybe it'll last 100 years, right? The default on Arweave is 200 years. So that's kind of cool, right? And we get a lot of resonance with people on that. So like, if you look at Quote.Rocks right now, a lot of the people that are uploading stuff are just like random photos. One person, as a part of one of our NFT contests, knitted something every day and took a photo each day. And then they put that onto Arweave, and now it's part of history. Who knows what will come of that? Maybe those photos will be embedded into something else. They'll be added to another piece of art. It can continue to grow over time, right? And so we're talking about NFTs. We're not actually really talking about like digital collectibles per se, but rather just a standard for information that has a bundle of rights associated with it that allows it to persist beyond the lifetime of an individual because of the rules of the game that we're all playing. And if everybody opts into the rules at the same time, then the game changes, which is the really exciting part. I mean, the people opting into a new system of rules is what created the Declaration of Independence and resulted in global democracy. This also could happen for information. It's just a matter of time.
So, Robby, can you imagine somebody who's currently playing one of your blockchain games bequeathing in-game assets to a future generation if they were stored in some kind of perma-web? Do you think they're eventually going to have the kind of value? Oh, Al wants to take that one.
Well, no, I'm just saying I would though.
To make another analogy, imagine that your father was a race car driver who raced Ferraris in the 1960s. Who wouldn't want to inherit a 1960s racing Ferrari at this point in time, right? And it's no different. This is a digital version of an entertainment product that, was expensive, but not ridiculously expensive in its time, right? But is now scarce. I think one thing to think about, to go back without delving into the politics of the Declaration of Independence and democracy, but to go back into the idea of what NFTs can become. The beauty of them is that they're open composable assets. So the beauty is that we can't actually think of all the things that we could do with them yet, because that's such a big concept. But they're a platform upon which anybody else can build, including NFTs I own, for example. Sam can build something on them or for them or use them or offer me a service for them. So to give a kind of a rudimentary example, we make a game featuring Formula One cars. So primarily we sell cars in the game. And now other companies are making services for those cars. Many of them are financial DeFi services because that's where the market is right now. But if you go to the physical world analogy, think about when Henry Ford started mass manufacturing automobiles. That was before we had paved roads and petrol stations and service stations and tire manufacturers. And all those businesses came about because cars existed. So it created the opportunity based on that asset to build other industries. And I think that's the cool thing. It's about what can be invented then to service these NFTs in the future.
So we're at an early stage of not just the adoption of these NFTs, but also even the imagination as to where they might go. So let's kind of bring it back to art for a second. Kevin, what do you think about the existential threats, if you like, to collectors and creators within our sphere, within the crypto art sphere? Is there anything that could, or that signifies that there could be a bubble developing, or anything that suggests that, for some reason, art based on blockchain shouldn't be worth what some people are paying for it? What are your thoughts about those threats?
I don't see an existential threat based on a bubble. I do, like Sam has mentioned before, it would be sad if the asset attached to your token were to disappear. So I'm all for permanence. I want my NFT to persist. One of the things you're talking about, whether it's art that it might your wooden whittling job or whatever it was you were carving, whether it exists in 100 years or not, or whether that Ferrari exists since 1969. One thing you can be sure about with the NFT, it's always in mint condition. We never have a degradation of quality over time, which I personally like. That just doesn't factor in. I'm excited about the future. I like the idea of redefining the relationship in the first place between collector and art. With most physical art, I think the case is that you acquire a piece of art, you put it on the wall or in the corner of the room, and we know that what that relationship is. It's of owner and art, and it's sort of a passive relationship. It can be a deep, meaningful relationship, but it's pretty well defined. And I think now, whether it's with embedded DAOs or other ways to continually engage with the collector yourself, or like we say, third parties getting in the mix, there's no way to really stop that, and that's kind of exciting. I think we create a situation where the art can essentially collect the collector. You don't know what's going to happen the next day. Usually, that picture is going to be on the wall and it looks the same way it did yesterday and the day before that and for the last 20 years. But now we have the possibility that the art is evolving over time, and therefore the relationship between collector and art is evolving, and it's just a chance for I don't want to say a more meaningful relationship, but certainly opens us up to a future of how we redefine the relationship between collectors and art. I don't think there's a bubble, not in the sense that it's all just going to pop and explode and disappear, and people are going to wonder, what was everybody doing buying all those crazy NFTs? This is a long road. We're very early in, and prices will fluctuate on collectibles and art, but there's nothing to me that signifies that this is all just going to vanish.
But is there a danger that, as more and more use cases are discovered, we accelerate through these kind of shorter hype cycles, if you will, for different types of art? So, for example, we saw a quick boom in programmable art through companies like Async, where multiple layers were controlled by different artists, and then all of a sudden we're into the next thing, which is CryptoPunks and early blockchain art. And then we're suddenly into avatars, and then suddenly we're into generative art. Do you think that those hype cycles, and this is kind of open to it, maybe Al, you could go for this one. Do you think those hype cycles are accelerating? And if they are, is there a danger that we kind of compress them so much that there's not even time for a market to develop?
I have a Game Boy that I was gifted from my parents in 1998. I'm unlikely to give the Game Boy away. It's very unlikely. I probably will never sell it on eBay, and maybe one of my children will get it in a box someday, and then
along with the wood carving,
eBay, or maybe one of their kids might sell it on eBay. But by the time it ends up on eBay, it might be a very rare collectible. And even if I bought it for an obscene price as a collectible right now on eBay, there's a very high likelihood that, 50 or 100 years from now, there's going to be some nostalgia factor because these are significant in some way. Otherwise, they wouldn't get the attention that's required to put their price up that high. It's almost like as soon as you put value on these things, then they continue to have some kind of value in the future. The other side of it is the amount of time that we're talking about here, because we could have 4 different cycles of new types of collectors. I mean, we're doing all kinds of stuff with dynamic NFTs now that we didn't realize we were going to be into. And that's going to change some things, but it's also going to still, get more people into NFTs. It's going to broaden the actual reach of all the existing ones. So there's probably crypto kitties that'll sell in 20 years as collectibles because they'll still be around because these blockchains aren't going anywhere. I mean, the likelihood that any of the major blockchains shut down in the next 20 years is actually fairly low, I think. So if that's the case, the next 100 years could equally be the same. And if they do start to shut down, won't people migrate the good assets off to some other chain? Maybe they'll back them up to Arweave. And so if that's the case, then it's like, how long does this go for? Actually, this is kind of where a lot of the ideas around attention tracking came from. So when I first met Sam, it was probably about 8 or 9 months ago. And we were trying to ask him to give us a grant so we could scrape the whole internet and put it on Arweave, which is still the plan. But, we were a little ambitious at the time. We started to kind of use out little details. And at the time, though, I think your response was I can't give you a grant for that much because it's a lot of stuff. How are we going to prioritize? How are we going to get people to upload good stuff? And that's where this whole attention tracking thing came from, because it's a way of identifying which content is quality over time, too. So part of the thing we're really excited about is over time, this means that if you can track all the attention, you'll know which content is getting attention from reputable people. And so 30 years from now, we kind of have a lie detector if we go back and look at history, because we'll be able to see who the reputable people are and what they were looking at, and then who the other people were who were sharing things that weren't necessarily true. And we'll be able to see all of it transparently in one place, which is very, very cool. Anybody will. It'll be public information.
It's pretty interesting.
So it kind of brings up a question for me, and maybe, Robby, this was one for you, but I mean, Animoca is bringing big brands to the NFT market. And a lot of, the innovators in this space have been independent creators, like Kevin, working very much through their own kind of self-taught mechanisms and motives. Do you think that even if big brands come to dominate the NFT space, there is still a place for independent creators?
Absolutely. I think the reason that we work with big brands is because one of the mechanisms that we find to really try to attract and onboard sort of mass market audiences is to bring brands that they're familiar with, because those brands make the product feel a bit more accessible from that point of view. So we work, at the moment with a lot of brands, for example, in different types of sports, professional sports, because that way we can tap into those existing fan bases and attract them to a new kind of product that perhaps they weren't familiar with before. Because to them, maybe the idea of a blockchain wallet and blockchain is new, but they're big Formula One fans, so they're happy to go and buy Formula One cars, etc. And
It's possible we've lost Jon.
I think we've lost Jon.
Okay, well, how many minutes we got left? Do we self-moderate this?
What an unfortunate still. Should we tokenize it?
He's gone completely. Okay.
He's really
First, I still want to find out more about how Al plans to copy the entire internet and store that. You got to have a big server, my friend.
What's with these coin nodes in Arweave are for? So basically, the way this works, Arweave is designed to scale as big as it needs to get, because it's got an incentive model designed just for that. And they've courteously built all the tech for us. So what we've tried to do is to facilitate going after all this information. And so what coin nodes do, they have a thing called coin tasks. And it's basically like a consensus game. So you have a reward function, which lets them claim rewards. And you have a distribution, basically a payload that they have to submit to say, I want to access those. And then there's an audit. And these are all written in JavaScript. It's 3 functions, and you can pull them from a template library. But you write one of these, and you give it to coin nodes, and then they go do something. You can even add an executable script that says, go scrape these 5 websites, and then submit the data in this format to this place. You can do consensus and that kind of stuff. The cool part of this, though, is that if you run a coin node and you do this kind of a web scraping task, technically, I guess, an archive of a website isn't really the same as owning the website. Yeah. So I see a scenario emerging where we can kind of have website owners sort of openly saying, hey, I'm open to people scraping my site and putting it into this archive. And I'm going to split some of the attention rewards with anybody who'll go and scrape it for me. So then there becomes kind of an open market for preserving any piece of information because there's a stream of revenue associated with having it. And the tokens in turn are then able to be used to pay for these core tasks. So
you planning on scraping the metaverse too?
I mean, that'd be the idea. We want to pull in as much as we can, right? Any useful piece of information should probably be put on Arweave, I think.
I think a lot of not a lot, maybe some decent proportion of the metaverse is already emerging on Arweave. Like the way we see ourselves in that stack is we're just a big hard drive for this virtual reality we're creating together. I think cyberspace is probably a better word for it. And indeed, we're already inside it, as far as I can tell. There's no...
Cyberspace sounds so retro.
You guys are in little boxes on my computer screen.
Yeah, I know. It's actually quite interesting. Like there was all of this study of, cybernetics way back in the 70s and 80s, and everyone's forgotten about it. But actually, where we are today is exactly in the cybernetic world that they were talking about. They were just too early. So yeah, bring back the old good phrases because there's a bunch of like existing strong research associated with them, I would say.
There's a book called Neuromancer that describes hacking before they had servers. Well, these are out there. There's all these books that they wrote, like really brilliant people who are thinking about this world that we're in now, and it's all out there. They've actually figured out a lot of it already.
Although, to be honest, most of the time, the world we're in now was created by all of us who read those books when we were teenagers.
Isaac Asimov designed everything.
Well, there is no metaverse without NFTs, right?
I don't know that that's true.
No.
I think you can have a metaverse without NFTs. I think that actually the really interesting thing about cyberspace is that it's the only place that humans will ever inhabit where we have abundance. And NFTs are a really interesting mechanism of, I would say, calling back to our savannah-birthed past, where we all came from as monkeys evolving over time, where we're drawn to scarce things. We have essentially recreated scarcity inside cyberspace, but in a new and strange way, where actually the data isn't scarce, because you can't make it scarce. You can't stop someone copying that JPEG. But the flexing associated with ownership is still very real. So yeah, I think you can definitely have a cyberspace without NFTs. I think actually all of the early experiments in cyberspace were like that, like Second Life, for example.
Right, but one of the key reasons that Second Life and others like it failed is because of a lack of persistence in the relationships between characters. So if you're not invested in the people you meet in any community, then you don't go further with that relationship. If somebody can just flick a switch and delete their history and disappear, then any investment you've made in that relationship is gone. So I
like the early IRC servers, for example, have huge communities and lots of deep social relationships. And they go, are on Freenode, and then one day Freenode decides that actually time for the servers to go. Or I think there was some recent thing about literally Freenode did just say everyone is incompatible, or they restarted, they lost the contents of the server more or less. But those relationships still exist because it's not quite that simple. The metaverse and cyberspace is this kind of like interconnection between humans, would you say, helped by technology. And humans always find routes to each other through different technology. So you have friends that you're playing like one game with, you'll play another game with them. It doesn't have to be in some kind of larger operating system that is coherent. It's just humans have a way of finding each other.
But still, the NFT is not just about the flex and engineering scarcity for the sake of baiting humans who seem to want to possess things. I think in its best sense, it's a node around which communities can gather and interact. That's, I think, the immediate future of the NFT is with the embedded collective intelligence, which has its utility in every arena we've discussed.
Yes, and I think the Industrial Revolution happened because we figured out how to have economies where we traded things of value. And the NFT and tokenization is essentially the exchange of value, of course. And so that's actually creating a whole new level of sophistication in our online interactions.
Well, it is the exchange of something, right? And that is the question at the core of all of this. What precisely is that something? It is pretty objectively true that something is not. Ownership of pixels is just not quite there, because in the sense of any normal, or would you say, I would say that this model of ownership, then, if we are still to call it ownership, has very little connection with the old model of ownership. If you owned something in the physical space, you had some kind of privileged control or access to it in almost every single sense. It's okay that this is different, but we shouldn't just say that they are a natural continuation of each other. I don't think that's a fair way of putting it.
One thought on that note.
Yeah.
There's this thing though, right? Like you mentioned IRC, like forums in IRC were like the early section of the internet. Like when I first started getting into LimeWire, that's how I figured out how to hack LimeWire. That's why I wrote Python for the first time, right? And so the thing that I've noticed is that if we imagine if we lost Stack Overflow, the internet would stop. There would be no code written for about 3 weeks while we rebuilt all the information and hacked through it to figure out how to actually fix all the bugs. It would literally end the internet for 3 or 4 weeks. We wouldn't be able to build new apps. Like we would be stuck fixing bugs for 8 hours. It'd be crazy. And the thing about that that's crazy is that if that is not owned in a decentralized fashion, then the delete comment button is inside of someone's firewall. And that means that someone can press that button.
Yeah, control over information. Right. It's scary.
So that's it. And there is actually control. There is ownership. There is a sense of like NFTs allow you to own a piece of information that has decentralized rules, which means it can protect the information. Well, I think that's really valuable. Now we have to have that. We can't have it
on the centralized web. Yes, much more so. But actually, in fairness, even on the centralized web, the ownership doesn't. So an NFT that points to an image stored on, I know, Raritable's servers or something like this.
Well, sure.
Someone does control it. That's true. It's not actually the person that bought the NFT. It's Rarible. And the scary thing, of course, there is that Rarible, 20 years from now might not have. I mean, I don't mean to pick on Rarible. I'm not. They use the system, but like whatever platform this is, they might not have an incentive to replicate that data, and so they have the control, but also the responsibility, and no incentive to maintain it. So that's the risk.
I would have said, Sam, that perhaps that's just a function of imperfect architecture with many of today's players.
Yeah.
Because it's early days and not many companies are really thinking through the actual meaning of permanence and actually setting up for that purpose.
I totally agree. But I think that once you put the data onto a permanent ledger, then you remove the problem that you've given a responsibility to someone that's not appropriately incentivized to fulfill it well.
Yes.
That's great, but also you're in this position where you're talking about ownership in a way that is not a strong correlation with the old system. And for what it's worth, I think that's okay. Actually, I think that this is really, really exciting. It could usher in a new era of art where all of the great works of humanity are available to all people all the time, and those creators are appropriately incentivized to make them, because there's this sort of flexing component that people want to buy into. And I would call those the sponsors, not the owners, but whatever, semantics, basically. There are people that want to show that they are associated with this concept, this piece of art, and they're willing to pay for it. That pays the artist for creating the art. And the better the art, the more money they'll get. So that incentive system is complete. But at the same time, that piece of art is available to all people. It is actually in abundance. It is not scarce. And that it strikes me as a better world.
There can be benevolence without the flex. You can want to share in the experience of the art and be a patron to the arts without flexing.
Okay, yeah, exactly. I mean, that's why I would call it sponsorship, not ownership.
Yeah.
This does exist in the normal world. And
so I'm going to take away benevolence without flex as one of the key concepts to emerge from this particular panel. Guys, we are pretty much at time here. This is really developing into an even more fascinating conversation, but I'm afraid that my warning. So I'd like to just thank you all for joining in. Hopefully by 4G. So Robby, Sam, Kevin, and Al, thank you very much for giving up your time, your expertise, and
thanks for having us, Jon.
Thanks, Jon.
Thanks, Jon.
Thanks,
everyone. Take care.